Big news! The changes that Classic set is going to be facing has finally been released. Some changes had to be made because some of the Classic cards would just constantly be played and perhaps overshadow all of the new expansions since we're rotating in Standard now. So Ancient of Lore, 5/5 draw a card or restore 5 health. So you can compare the draw a card with Azure Drake, 5 mana 4/4 draw a card. Plus 1 spell damage as well, which is still very good in Druid because Wrath and Swipe are still around. The Ancient of Lore was mainly good for the draw 2 cards. When you take down the draw a card, it's like the card is about 1.5 mana less good. And nerfing any card by like 1.5 mana or 1 card is bad. Playing Ancient of Lore to draw a card is poor. What about restoring 5 health? Well, Paladins have a card called Guardian of Kings, which has not seen play in some time, which is 7 mana, 5/6, restore 6 health. Anyways, the main point is, this is a serious hit to Druid. Ancient of Lore was in pretty much all the Druid decks. It's still a flexible card, so the mana cost is still fair, but it's now under the curve of playability. Force of Nature was a card that everyone was whining about. Well, really, Force of Nature Savage Roar, and people were contemplating, is it Force of Nature that's the problem, or is it Savage Roar which is the problem? The answer, as Blizzard has come up with, is Force of Nature is the problem. Although, this is subtle and interesting. So it gets a completely redesign. There were actually jokes before that Force of Nature would just say summon 3/2/2 treants. And it turns out that that is what is happening. However, at least we also have a -1 mana, which means it's 5 mana for 6/6 in stats. You can still Force of Nature Savage Roar, it just takes 1 more turn. Now the main problem with counting Force of Nature as a 6/6 is that it's really vulnerable to 2 damage AoE, and 2 damage AoE is kinda common. But this is still a playable card. By keeping Savage Roar, you keep Aggro Druid around as a possibility. I like this. Keeper of the Grove, an auto-include in every single Druid deck since the game has been released, has finally gotten taken down a peg. Blizzard wants Silence to not be as powerful. Druid gets to keep their Keeper of the Grove Silence option for 4 mana, and they get to keep their flexibility of choose 1, but the main problem here is a 4 mana 2/2 deal 2 damage isn't that strong. We can compare it with Ironforge Rifleman and Stormpike Commando. And Silence a minion, we have Spellbreaker. Druids actually used to run both Keeper of the Groves as well as Spellbreaker, partly because the 4 mana 2/4 deal 2 damage was quite strong. But removing those 2 stats means that it can no longer kill 2 3/2s and still live. Now it just kills 2 3/2s and then dies in the process. I think this card also doesn't see much play anymore, though it does hold that flexibility, which might make it have some play. Ironbeak Owl gets nerfed to 3 mana. Aggro decks like Face Hunter ran it, sometimes Zoo ran a copy. You even saw control decks like Handlock or Reno Lock, and it occasionally made its way into things like Midrange Paladin too. It was just very flexible, so almost every deck had an Ironbeak Owl in it, just as an out to silence something. It turns out that if you build your own cool minion, it's cool for your big minion to crush everything. So Owl gets nerfed, we get to see more things. Spellbreaker is probably the new Silence of Choice, which will make it into sim decks and will not make it into some decks. Whereas Ironbeak Owl will probably never see play anymore. There's not very many cards where if a card gets raised by 2 mana, it still sees play. However, Big Game Hunter is one of those. Big Game Hunter has often just completely taken the spotlight from cards such as Assassinate. Why play Assassinate when you can play an Assassinate which costs 2 fewer mana and you get a 4/2? This is now going to change into the situational card that it should be. So in the case that there are so many big minions out there, Control versus Control will still run Big Game Hunter, and that will sufficiently punish them, because if they face off against aggro, the Big Game Hunter is actually near unplayable, whereas against aggro you would previously play it as a 3 mana 4/2 and still probably trade with something that costs 3 mana or 2 mana. Hunter's Mark. Some people look at this and are wondering, wait, why? This card is very, very powerful. Perhaps in order to print more powerful Hunter cards in the future, this card has to get nerfed a bit. We can see that there were some control or mid-range hunter cards already pushed. So for there to be a 0 mana card to basically deal 6 damage, when you do it against a 7 health minion, that's a bit much. It's now properly placed at 1 mana, it's still really good if a hunter, which is control or mid-range, pops around. Blade Flurry, according to Blizzard, is a problem both because of heavy burst damage and board clear, and it being cheap. Now, instead of it doing all of those, it now does none of those. Well, no, it does one of those. Instead of being cheap, board clear, and burst, it is now board clear. 2 mana Blade Flurry is ridiculous when you think about it. It's 2 mana like Flame Strike the board after some preparations have been set up. Literally preparation. You preparation, you oil, and then you Blade Flurry. This would happen over and over again, and it would be a lot of burst damage, because it basically gave your hero Wind Fury, and it AoE'd the board. It's actually because of a card like Blade Flurry that Blizzard printed a card like Poisoned Blade. Poisoned Blade is so bad that you can kind of see why Blade Flurry had to get nerfed. I think this is a nerf that Blizzard is making in order for them to make rogues be able to tinker with weapon damage more, which is an interesting design space for them. Just something that they couldn't do before because Blade Flurry existed. So now it's unplayable. Maybe not unplayable. It's been compared to Shadow Flame from Warlock, where you destroy something of yours and you deal damage to all enemy minions. And it is similar. I don't know if Rogue will get any more AoE. I don't know if they need AoE. They seem to be very good at dealing single target damage with cards like Backstab and SI7 Agent. And there's even a joke going around that says, okay, Blizzard can just delete cards instead of nerfing. And this does seem like an extreme change, but it's still a specific tool. In a few years, people will look at the old Blade Flurry and think about, how did this card survive 2 years? But what they won't remember is that rogues didn't used to have all the great cards that they will have 2 years from now. A Knife Juggler gets changed, which is a change welcomed by a lot of people. So now it's a 2 mana 2/2, which is completely fair, because a 2 mana 3/2 with this ability was a bit much. I think this card might see play even though it is a 2 mana 2/2. Now granted, a lot of the cards that Knife Juggler was good with, like Haunted Creeper, are getting rotated out with Standard as well. And this is looking a little bit into Wild, making sure that Knife Juggler plus Haunted Creeper isn't still a thing. Yeah, I mean, it's just a really strong effect, which does deserve to be on a card that's a 2/2. Leper Gnome's nerf is very severe, but when you looked at how much damage Leper Gnome would be pumping out, it's very realistic that you play the Leper Gnome on turn 1, it attacks on turn 2, and it attacks on turn 3. Maybe you had to use a minion to kill the Leper Gnome, which meant that the Leper Gnome would deal the 2 damage to the minion as well, which is somewhere between 4, 6, or even 8 damage for a 1 mana card. That's a lot. So now it's a 1/1. I actually think this is kind of severe. I would have made it a 1 mana 2/1, Death Rattle, deal 1 damage to the enemy hero, but hey. Anyways, the point is we're not going to be seeing much of this Icky card anymore, which is good news because I feel Icky was not a card that many people wanted to play against on turn 1. Third little bit of a hit to the super face decks, which pretty much always ran Knife Juggler, Leper Gnome, and Arcane Golem. Well, Blizzard is learning that Charge is a bit OP, so Arcane Golem gets the hit as well. Now it's very similar to Dancing Swords. Instead of Death Rattle, your opponent draws a card, though. It's Battle Cry. Give your opponent a mana crystal. So it's like a 5 mana 4/4. Give your opponent a Wild Growth card that costs 0. That makes it look like really bad. It is really bad. No one would run this card anymore. And I think it would have been better as a 4/5, which still probably wouldn't be played, but might at least have seen some experimentation in super high-risk decks. So Molten Giant was the card that was most often a 16 stat card played for near 0, 1, or 2 mana. And that was really strong. Many of the decks weren't able to play Molten Giant even then, because you would have the risk of getting burst down by cards like Force of Nature Savage Roar or Arcane Golem. With burst damage going down, Molten Giant is less risky to play. So that's why they hit specifically Molten Giant. It's really, for hand luck, the fact that near the late game, they can go Molten Giant, Defender of Argus. That was so scary. Now, in order to play Molten Giant for 5 mana, you would need to be at 10 health, which is terrifying and near impossible. And in order to play it for free, you need to be at 5 health. When you think about it, it's actually kind of crazy that a card gets nerfed by 5 mana. But, hey, Molten Giant. I think the card will still see some fringe play, but it's going to be much more difficult. Like, by a lot. But again, you have to see how the meta shakes up. If there's no direct damage, then it's still good. And Silence has gone away, and BGH has gone away. So it just depends on how much over-the-top damage is in the meta. Master of Disguise might seem like a strange nerf to people, but I've actually been talking about this card a bit. Mostly because through the various Blizzard-related visits that I've had, it's just to open the room for more design space. Makes sense. A card like Animated Armor would be ridiculous if it were neutral. We can probably assume that there will be some rogue cards or neutral cards that are now absolutely ridiculous if you manage to stealth them permanently. Not that that is ever possible anymore. This card will pretty much never see any play anymore. Similar to how it has not seen play in the past. To recap, the big changes made are basically Druid loses 4 class cards. Keeper of the Grove, Ancient of Lore, Force of Nature, and Savage Roar. That and combined with Big Game Hunter, that's like 9 cards out of the typical Druid deck, which is great for the game. We're gonna see Druid not be the same thing. From the aggro decks, they lose 4 cards, Knife Juggler and Leper Gnome, and they possibly lose some Arcane Golems. A while ago, I did a standard rotation theory craft of the current decks out there, which ones would still be good moving forward. So there was Druid. Another one was Face Shaman, with Leper Gnome nerfed as well as Face Shaman not being that strong a deck to start with. I don't anticipate Face Shaman being that good. I thought Murloc Paladin was going to be a pretty strong contender since it doesn't lose that much. However, what I didn't know at the time is that the reward set is also rotating out. And Old Murkai getting lost means anything can happen is a lot worse when it can't summon the Old Murkai. There was Rogue. Rogue was going to be pretty good too. Blade Flurry hit is huge on that deck. That deck might still operate, but it's going to have to go a little bit of a different direction. Finally, there's Freeze Mage. There's actually some criticism that, wait, out of all the decks that are getting rotated into Standard, Freeze Mage seems to not lose that much. But they did lose Mad Scientist. That's about it. One thing to remember, though, is that Freeze Mage has already been dealt with in the past. Their Blizzard got nerfed, their Frost Nova got nerfed, their Cone of Cold got nerfed. It's possible that things will do fine without Freeze Mage getting hit any further. And they do have that constant counter of Control Warrior. One of their main opponents, Druid, has gotten nerfed to the ground though, especially the ones that are scary to Freeze Mages, the Force Savage Burst. There is still an Eater of Secrets card out there, but against Freeze Mage, Kazan Mystic was actually better. A little opinion piece by me at the end here. I'm pretty happy with this on a first pass. It seems like all of the standard decks, outside of specifically Face Shaman and Freeze Mage, which is kind of a question mark right now on whether or not it's that strong. It's certainly a very skill-intensive deck to play. And Blizzard has a lot of statistics about how much decks win. And Freeze Mage is specifically a deck that can be countered by Control Warrior very easily, as well as burst decks. If it were up to me, I'd probably have added about 10 more cards on this list. Alexstrasza is surely a card that the Hearthstone team discussed at length as one of the cards to get changed, because it hits 2 main decks. It hits Control Warrior, it hits Freeze Mage, and overall it's just a very powerful effect which opens a lot of combo opportunities. I think that Alexstrasza might have made for a really interesting change if it went from set someone's health to 15 to set someone's health to 20. Because 1, that rewards greater control play of using Alexstrasza on yourself. 2, the Alexstrasza route usually has your opponent staying around 30. So you Alex your opponent and it basically does 5 less damage to it. I think slipping in that change would have pleased a lot of people. Besides, isn't Alexstrasza supposed to bring life? So why does it only set you at 15? Just saying. Now, one of the cards that constantly gets a mob mentality on is Divine Favor. I'm going to say that I think Divine Favor is perfectly fine. It feels really bad when your opponent is down to 0 cards and they top deck a card and they play Divine Favor and then they draw 7 cards. But it turns out that that's in a specific matchup, and perhaps such a card is good design because it's specifically good against control decks. In a more realistic world, Divine Favor is a serious risk that you run when playing your deck, and there's a really interesting choice on whether you even run any Divine Favor, or maybe 1 or maybe 2 copies, because if you draw both copies of Divine Favor, it's actually a complete disaster. And in certain matchups, Divine Favor is the worst card in your deck. In fact, in a lot of matchups, the card is quite bad. And that's coming from me. I play a lot of control decks, and I am like the victim of Divine Favor a lot of the times. I tap it as handlock, I have like mid-range control decks, I'm the mayor of Valley Town, and I think Divine Favor is fine. They can steal my value, that's fine. But the baseline of what you should consider is that I'm very happy with these changes. They probably hit about the bare minimum of cards in order to change things up a significant amount, as well as open up a lot of design space in the future. So I look forward to seeing what everyone comes up with when all of the old gods cards are released, and it's going to just be a complete Wild West for a while for Standard, and that is what a lot of players have been looking forward to for a while. And good news, as always, if you own these cards, you can get some dust value because you'll get your full crafting cost disenchanting for any of these changes, as is typical.